The calculator's keys clicked under my fingers as I double-checked the final equations, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the physics lab windows at Lincoln High. Around me, empty desks bore the scattered remnants of another day's lessons, but I remained anchored to my station, perfecting the mathematical proof that would accompany my science fair project. The numbers aligned perfectly, each variable falling into place like pieces of an intricate puzzle I'd been solving for months. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Still here, Elena? Mr. Davidson poked his head through the doorway, his graying beard catching the golden light. Your parents know you're staying this late again? I glanced at the wall clock. 6:30. Mom would be setting the table for dinner about now, arranging the good china she reserved for weeknight meals since Dad's promotion to regional sales director. They understand, I replied, though understanding and approval weren't quite the same thing in the Morrison household. The drive home took me through the winding streets of Millbrook Estates, where manicured lawns stretched before colonial houses that all seemed to whisper the same message. Success has a specific appearance, and we've mastered it. Our driveway curved around a fountain Dad had installed last spring, a marble centerpiece he'd pointed out to neighbors during the annual block party. Italian craftsmanship, he'd explained, running his palm along its smooth edge. You can always tell the quality work. Inside, the familiar rhythm of evening preparations greeted me. Mom moved between the kitchen and dining room with practiced efficiency, her silk blouse unmarked despite an hour of cooking. She'd changed from her real estate office attire into something more suited for what she called family presentation, though I'd never been entirely sure who we were presenting to. There you are, sweetheart. She looked up from arranging flowers in a crystal vase. How was the lab work today? Productive. I finished the calculations for the environmental impact section. Dad emerged from his study, loosening his tie as he surveyed the dining room with the same attention he gave quarterly sales reports. Environmental impact of what exactly? He settled into his chair at the head of the table, unfolding his napkin with a practiced snap. The water purification system I've been developing for the science competition. I took my usual seat, watching his expression shift from casual interest to something more guarded. The water purification system I've been developing. The prototype can remove heavy metals from contaminated groundwater using locally sourced materials. Mom paused mid-motion, the serving spoon hovering over the roasted vegetables. Is this still that project for the county fair thing? The Regional Science Symposium, I corrected gently. But it's evolved beyond that. Dr. Patterson from the university thinks it has real applications for communities dealing with industrial contamination. The silence stretched just long enough to feel significant. Dad cut his chicken with measured precision, each movement deliberate. Dr. Patterson. She's heading the environmental engineering department. I've been corresponding with her about the research methodology. She wants to recommend the project for state competition. State? Mom's voice carried a note I couldn't quite identify. Elena, that sounds very time-consuming. It would mean presenting in Sacramento next month. There's also a scholarship component. First place receives full tuition to any participating university. Dad set down his fork. Sacramento is quite far from here. 3 hours by car. I'd need to stay overnight for the weekend competition. The conversation continued around safer topics after that. Dad's upcoming client presentation, Mom's newest property listing, my younger brother Jake's basketball practice schedule. But something had crystallized in those few minutes. A recognition that my excitement about the project didn't translate into the shared joy I'd expected. Later, while loading the dishwasher, I overheard fragments of conversation from the living room. Dad's voice, lower than usual, getting carried away with these academic pursuits. Mom's response, too quiet to catch completely, needs to focus on practical matters. In my bedroom that night, I spread the project materials across my desk.
Months of research filled 3 thick binders, each section meticulously documented and cross-referenced. The prototype sat in a clear container, its simple appearance belying the complex chemistry occurring within. When I'd first discovered I could remove 93% of lead contamination using materials costing less than $12, I'd run downstairs to share the breakthrough with anyone who would listen. Jake had looked up from his video game long enough to nod appreciatively. Cool, Lena. Can it clean the pool water too?
But Mom had been on a conference call, and Dad was reviewing spreadsheets. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Mom had said during a brief pause, her attention already shifting back to the phone. "Very impressive." The encouragement felt genuine, but distant, like praise offered from across a wide room. Now, organizing my research notes, I tried to pinpoint when the distance had begun. Perhaps it was sophomore year, when I'd chosen advanced chemistry over the art classes Mom suggested would be more well-rounded. Or junior year, when I'd declined the country club's summer internship program to work with Dr. Martinez's research team at the community college. "Elena has always been academically inclined," I'd heard Mom explain to Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store. The words weren't dismissive, exactly, but they carried an undertone that suggested academic inclination was something to be managed rather than celebrated. My phone buzzed with a text from my lab partner, Sarah. "Did you see the email from Mr. Davidson? Regional competition judges want to interview the top 3 projects next week." I stared at the message, excitement and anxiety battling in my chest. The interview would be another step towards state competition, another validation that the work mattered beyond our small lab space. But it would also mean more time away from family dinners, more conversations about impractical pursuits, more of the careful politeness that had replaced genuine enthusiasm in discussions about my work. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather for October, and I found Mom in the garden, deadheading the last of the season's roses. She worked with the same methodical precision she brought to staging houses for sale, each cut calculated for maximum visual impact. "Mom, can we talk about the science competition?" She straightened, brushing soil from her gardening gloves. "Of course, honey. What about it?" "I want you to understand how important this is to me. The research could actually help people, communities dealing with water contamination, developing regions without access to expensive filtration systems." Her expression softened, and for a moment, I saw something like pride in her eyes. "That's very noble, Elena, but you're 17. There's plenty of time for changing the world later." "Later when?" "After college, after you've established yourself professionally, after you understand how the real world works." She resumed her work on the roses, each word punctuated by the snap of her pruning shears. "But this is how the real world works. Scientists doing research, making discoveries, solving problems. Academic research is wonderful, sweetheart, but it's not exactly stable. Look at your cousin Michael. He has that PhD in philosophy, and what's he doing? Teaching community college and living in a studio apartment at 35? The comparison stung more than I'd expected. This is different. Environmental engineering has practical applications, industry demand. And your father's company is always looking for bright young people in sales. People skills, Elena. That's what builds careers. Not hiding in laboratories with experiments that may or may not work out." That afternoon, I called Dr. Patterson to discuss the interview preparation. Her enthusiasm crackled through the phone as she described the judging panel, the caliber of competing projects, the potential for real impact if the work continued. When I mentioned my parents' concerns about practicality, she laughed, not dismissively, but with the warmth of someone who'd navigated similar conversations. "Elena, when I was your age, my father wanted me to study business administration. He'd say, 'Engineering is no field for a young lady. What about accounting? That's respectable work.' What changed his mind?" "Nothing changed his mind. I changed my path anyway. Sometimes the people who love us can't see the possibilities we see.
that doesn't make the possibilities less real. The words stayed with me through dinner, through homework, through the restless hour before sleep when the day's conversations replayed in endless loops. I thought about possibilities and practicality, about the difference between being supported and being managed, about the careful way my parents discussed my future as if it were a problem requiring their solution, rather than a canvas waiting for my vision. In the darkness of my room, listening to the house settle into quiet, I wondered if other families celebrated their children's ambitions, or if love always came wrapped in the desire to redirect, to moderate, to guide towards safer ground. The water purification system sat silent on my desk, a small revolution contained in plastic and metal, waiting for the world to decide whether it mattered. Tomorrow would bring another day of calculations, another step toward a future I could envision clearly but couldn't seem to share with the people who mattered most. The foundation of my childhood certainty that family meant unconditional support, that achievements brought joy to everyone who loved you, had developed its first hairline crack.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I just didn't know yet how wide it would grow. The acceptance letter arrived on a Thursday, thick cream paper that felt substantial between my fingers. I found it waiting on the kitchen counter when I returned from my after-school lab session, propped against the coffee maker where Mom always placed mail she considered important. The university letterhead caught the overhead light, and my heart hammered as I tore open the envelope. "Congratulations on your selection as a Regional Science Symposium finalist," the letter began. "Your water purification research has been chosen from over 300 submissions to compete at the state level in Sacramento." My hands shook as I read the details. The competition would span 3 days in November, including presentations to a panel of industry professionals, university researchers, and government officials. Winners would receive scholarship opportunities ranging from $5,000 to $50,000, plus internship placements with environmental consulting firms. "Elena?" Dad's voice carried from the living room. "Could you come in here, please?" I walked in clutching the letter, my excitement barely contained. Dad sat in his leather recliner, still wearing his work clothes, while Mom perched on the edge of the sofa with her laptop balanced on her knees. The evening news played softly in the background, but neither seemed to be watching. "We received a call from your school today," Dad began, his tone measured. "Mr. Davidson mentioned you've been spending considerable time on this science project." "It's not just a project anymore." I held up the letter. "I made it to the state finals. This could change everything." Mom closed her laptop with a soft click. "Sweetheart, we need to talk about priorities." The word hung in the air like a challenge. "What do you mean?" "Your grades in other subjects have been slipping. Your English teacher mentioned you haven't turned in 2 assignments this month." "I've been focused on the research. The submission deadline was—" "That's exactly the problem." Mom's voice carried a patience that felt more exhausting than anger. "You're becoming obsessed with this one thing at the expense of everything else." I stared at them, processing the accusation. "I missed 2 assignments. My overall GPA is still 3.8. It was 4.0 last semester, before you started spending every afternoon in that laboratory. The laboratory where I'm doing groundbreaking research that could help millions of people access clean water." Mom sighed, the kind of deep exhale that suggested she'd been preparing for this conversation. "Elena, you're 17 years old. This level of intensity isn't healthy for someone your age." "What would be healthy? Spending my afternoons at the mall? Dating boys who only care about football scores?" "Socializing with peers your own age," Dad said firmly. "Developing well-rounded interests, building the kind of relationships that matter in the real world." The real world. There it was again, that phrase they wielded like a weapon against anything that didn't fit their narrow definition of appropriate teenage behavior. "This is the real world," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm.
Climate change, water scarcity, environmental justice, these are the problems my generation will inherit. And they'll still be there when you're older and better equipped to handle them. Right now, you should be focusing on getting into a good college with a practical major. I am focusing on college. This research could earn me a full scholarship to Stanford or MIT. Dad leaned forward in his chair. Elena, we've been discussing this with some other parents at the club. Dr. Henley's daughter went through a similar phase, obsessed with marine biology, spent all her time at the aquarium. Know what she's doing now? She's in business school at Northwestern, much happier, much more realistic about her future. The comparison felt like a slap. So you've been talking about me at the country club? Discussing how to fix my phase? We're concerned about you, Mom said softly. This research project has consumed your life. You barely speak to us anymore, except to explain why you can't make family dinners or weekend plans. Because I'm working on something important. Important to who? To some professors who want to use your free labor? To companies that will patent your ideas and profit from them while you're still in high school?
I felt something fundamental shift inside me, like a tectonic plate finding a new position. Important to me. The silence that followed felt charged with unspoken ultimatums. Mom reopened her laptop and began typing, the keys clicking with artificial urgency. Dad turned back to the television where a weather reporter was explaining weekend storm patterns with enthusiastic gestures. "We've made a decision," Mom announced without looking up from her screen. "You're going to take a break from the laboratory work." "What?" 2 weeks, Dad added, still facing the TV. "Time to catch up on your other assignments, reconnect with friends, remember what it's like to be a teenager." "The state competition is in 3 weeks. I need to prepare my presentation, run final tests on the prototype." "The deadline for withdrawal is tomorrow," Mom interrupted. "We've already spoken with Mr. Davidson." The room seemed to tilt. "You withdrew me from the competition?" "We scheduled a meeting to discuss it," she corrected. "Tomorrow after school, we'll all sit down together and make a rational decision about what's best for your future." I stood up so quickly the coffee table wobbled. "You can't do this." "We're your parents," Dad said, finally turning to face me. "It's our job to protect you from decisions you'll regret." "Protect me from what? From pursuing my passion? From potentially changing the world?" "From throwing away your childhood for a fantasy that might not pan out," Mom replied, her voice sharp with something like fear. "Elena, you're brilliant. No one is questioning that. But this obsession with saving the world is preventing you from living your own life." I thought about the months of research, the late nights spent refining calculations, the moment when I'd realized my simple filter could revolutionize water treatment in developing regions. I thought about Dr. Patterson's encouragement, Mr. Davidson's pride when I'd presented my preliminary findings, the university officials who'd called to discuss collaboration opportunities. "This is my life," I said quietly. "No." Dad stood up, his frame imposing in the lamplight. "This is an escape from your life, and it ends now." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in endless variations. In some versions, I found the perfect words to make them understand. In others, they suddenly recognized the magnitude of what I'd accomplished and embraced my ambitions with tears of joy. But in the version that had actually occurred, they'd made their position crystal clear. My dreams were inconvenient interruptions to their vision of appropriate teenage development. The next morning brought a peculiar atmosphere to our house, as if everyone was performing normalcy while acknowledging that something essential had broken. Mom made pancakes, my favorite, and asked about my plans for the weekend. Dad offered to drive me to school, mentioning he'd noticed my car making strange noises lately. "We love you, Elena," Mom said as she handed me my lunch. "Everything we do is because we love you." I accepted the brown bag without responding, understanding that love and control had become synonymous in their vocabulary. At school, Mr. Davidson pulled me aside before first period.
His expression was carefully neutral, but I caught the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "Your parents called this morning," he said. "They've asked to meet this afternoon to discuss your participation in the state competition. They want me to withdraw." He nodded slowly. "They mentioned concerns about balance, about your other academic responsibilities. What do you think?" Mr. Davidson glanced around the empty hallway, then leaned against his classroom door. "I think you've produced the most innovative research I've seen in 23 years of teaching. I think the university professors who've reviewed your work are genuinely excited about its applications. And I think you're old enough to have a voice in decisions about your own future. But," he said, "but they're your parents, and they have legal authority over your educational choices until you turn 18.
The meeting that afternoon unfolded exactly as I'd expected. Mom and Dad presented their concerns with the polished delivery of a business presentation, complete with talking points about balance, age-appropriate activities, and long-term academic success. Mr. Davidson listened respectfully, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but never directly challenging their authority. When they asked for my input, I tried one last time to explain what the research meant, not just to me, but to communities struggling with contaminated water sources, to developing regions that couldn't afford expensive filtration systems, to a future where clean water would become increasingly scarce. "That's exactly what we're talking about," Mama interrupted. "You're 17 years old, Elena. The weight of the world's problems isn't yours to carry. Someone has to carry it." "Someone will," Dad agreed. "Someone older, more experienced, with proper funding and institutional support." The withdrawal form required only 3 signatures. Mine was the last, and my hand trembled as I wrote my name on the line that erased months of work with a few strokes of ink. Walking to my car afterward, I felt something like grief settling in my chest. Not just for the lost opportunity, but for the realization that the people who claimed to know me best had fundamentally misunderstood who I was becoming. They saw obsession where I saw dedication, fantasy where I saw possibility, dangerous single-mindedness where I saw focused passion. That evening, I called Dr. Patterson to explain the situation. Her silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Alina, this is heartbreaking, not just for you, but for the communities that could have benefited from your work." Maybe they're right. Maybe I was getting too focused on one thing. Let me tell you something about focus. Every major breakthrough in environmental science has come from people who are willing to focus intensely on problems others considered impossible or impractical. Your parents love you, but they're asking you to be ordinary when you have the capacity to be extraordinary. After hanging up, I sat in my room surrounded by 3 months of research that would now collect dust in storage boxes. The prototype still worked perfectly, still removed 93% of heavy metal contamination, still cost less than $12 to construct. But without the platform of competition, without the connections to university programs and environmental organizations, it would remain nothing more than an impressive science fair project. I understood then that displacement didn't always involve physical relocation. Sometimes it meant being systematically separated from your own ambitions, your own sense of purpose, your own vision of who you might become. I'd been exiled from my own future, and the people who claimed to love me most had signed the deportation papers. The weeks following my withdrawal from the state competition passed in a strange haze of enforced normalcy. Mom scheduled activities to fill my newly available time, a pottery class on Thursdays, volunteer work at the hospital gift shop, even a trial membership at the country club's teen social group. Each obligation felt like a carefully placed barrier between me and the laboratory that had become my second home. "See how much more relaxed you seem?" she observed one evening as I arranged magazines in the hospital gift shop's waiting area. "You're getting your color back."
I caught my reflection in the shop's mirror and wondered what color I'd supposedly lost. The girl staring back looked hollow around the eyes, like someone recovering from a long illness. At school, I threw myself into the assignments I'd neglected, producing essays and problem sets with mechanical precision. My English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, returned a paper on environmental literature with an A+ and a note scrolled in red ink. Powerful voice. Have you considered the journalism program? The suggestion sparked something I'd almost forgotten. The possibility that my interests could take different forms, find new outlets. I stayed after class to discuss the school newspaper's environmental reporting section. We've never had a student tackle real investigative pieces, Mrs. Rodriguez explained, gathering her papers as afternoon sunlight slanted through the classroom windows. Most focus on recycling programs or Earth Day events, but you could examine actual environmental issues affecting our community. That evening, instead of working on the college applications my parents had strategically left on my desk, I researched local environmental concerns. What I discovered made my stomach tighten with familiar outrage. Riverside Industries, a chemical manufacturing plant 15 miles east of Millbrook, had been cited repeatedly for groundwater contamination over the past 3 years. The violations were buried in state regulatory reports, dense with technical language that obscured their significance. But when I translated the data into plain English, the picture became clear. The plant was systematically poisoning the water supply of 3 rural communities. I spent the weekend creating a comprehensive map of contamination zones, cross-referencing property values, demographics, and health department records. The pattern that emerged was both predictable and infuriating. The affected communities were predominantly low-income areas with minimal political representation. Riverside Industries faced fines that amounted to less than their weekly profit margins, and cleanup efforts remained perpetually under review. This is exactly what my water purification system could address, I told myself, staring at the data spread across my desk. The irony felt like salt in an open wound.
Monday morning, I presented my findings to Mrs. Rodriguez. She listened intently, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated her growing excitement about the story's potential. Elena, this is investigative journalism. Real journalism. Have you shown this to your parents? I shook my head. They think I should focus on more balanced topics. Balanced? Her eyebrows rose. There's nothing to balance when corporations are poisoning communities. That afternoon, I attended my first newspaper staff meeting. The room buzzed with the organized chaos of deadline preparation. Students hunched over computers while the editor, Marcus Chen, fielded questions and assigned last-minute stories. We have a new member, Mrs. Rodriguez announced, Elena Morrison. She's proposing an investigative piece on industrial water contamination. Marcus looked up from his laptop. What kind of contamination? I outlined my research, watching as interest flickered across the faces around the table. These weren't the politely dismissive expressions I'd grown accustomed to at home, but genuine engagement with the substance of what I'd discovered. How would you source this? Asked Katie Walsh, the senior editor. We'd need official statements, expert interviews, community impact testimonials. I have contacts at the university. I thought of Dr. Patterson and her network of environmental scientists, and I know people in the affected communities from my volunteer work last summer. Summer volunteer work, Marcus leaned forward. Water quality testing with the county health department, part of a youth environmental program. The room went quiet. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. Alina, you buried the lead. You have professional experience in water quality assessment. It struck me then how differently my interests were being received here compared to home. The same activities my parents viewed as concerning obsessions were being recognized as valuable expertise. Give me a proposal by Wednesday, Katie said. If it's solid, we'll run it as our lead story next month. That evening at dinner, I mentioned my involvement with the school newspaper. Journalism? Dad's fork paused midway to his mouth. That's an interesting hobby. It's not a hobby. I'm investigating environmental contamination that's affecting thousands of people. Mom and Dad exchanged a look, one of those wordless conversations that had become increasingly frequent since the science competition incident. Sweetheart, Mom began carefully, Investigative reporting can be very confrontational. Are you sure that's the image you want to project? Image to whom? To college admissions officers, to future employers, to the communities we're part of. She gestured vaguely toward the dining room window, beyond which lay the manicured perfection of Millbrook Estates. You mean Riverside Industries might not appreciate being exposed for contaminating people's drinking water? Dad set down his fork entirely. Elena, you're talking about accusing a major employer in this region of criminal activity. I'm talking about reporting documented violations that are already public record. Public record that nobody else has bothered to report on, Mom pointed out. Don't you think there might be a reason for that? I stared at her, trying to process the implication. You think I should ignore environmental crimes because other journalists have been too lazy or too bought off to investigate them? I think you should be careful about making enemies of powerful institutions, Dad said firmly, especially when you're still building your own future. Over the following days, I noticed how my parents' concerns manifested in subtle ways. Mom happened to run into Mrs. Rodriguez at the grocery store and mentioned her worries about students taking on overly ambitious projects. Dad called the school counselor to discuss my course load and extracurricular balance. But something had shifted in my perception. Where I'd once seen parental protection, I now recognized a pattern of systematic discouragement. They weren't trying to shield me from genuine dangers. They were trying to prevent me from pursuing anything that might disrupt their carefully constructed social position. The realization crystallized during a conversation with my younger brother, Jake. He'd been unusually quiet during dinner, picking out his food while Mom described the Hendersons' vacation to Tuscany.
"Are you planning to do journalism in college?" he asked as we loaded the dishwasher afterward. "Maybe. Why?" "Mom and Dad think it's a bad idea. I heard them talking about how you're becoming too political, too confrontational." He handed me a plate to rinse. "They're worried you're going to embarrass the family." The plate slipped from my hands, clattering against the sink's edge. Embarrass them how? By writing stories that make our neighbors uncomfortable? By associating with the wrong kind of people? By focusing on problems instead of solutions? Jake's voice carried an odd maturity, as if he were reciting concepts he didn't fully understand but had absorbed through repeated exposure. "Jake, what kind of solutions should I focus on?" He shrugged. "Positive ones, like charity fundraisers or community improvement projects, things that bring people together instead of creating division." That night, I called my friend Sarah, who'd continued with the science competition after my withdrawal. "I need to ask you something," I said. "When you tell your parents about your research, how do they respond?" "They ask a million questions," she laughed. "Mom wants to understand every detail, even when I'm explaining protein synthesis for the 100th time. Dad keeps suggesting new angles to explore." "Why?" I described my parents' reaction to both the water purification project and the journalism investigation. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Elena, that's not normal. My parents might worry about me working too late or stress levels, but they've never tried to stop me from pursuing something I'm passionate about. What if your passion involved criticizing local businesses or challenging community leaders? Then they'd want to make sure I had solid evidence and good mentorship, but they wouldn't ask me to stop caring about injustice." After hanging up, I sat in my room surrounded by newspaper clippings and regulatory reports, feeling the weight of a revelation I'd been avoiding for months. My parents' love was conditional, not on my behavior or my character, but on my willingness to confine my ambitions within their comfort zone. They claimed to want what was best for me, but their definition of best required me to be smaller, quieter, less threatening to the social order they'd worked so hard to join. My scientific research had challenged their belief that 17-year-olds should focus on age-appropriate activities. My journalism investigation challenged their conviction that good citizens don't rock boats. I thought about the families in the contaminated communities, dealing with health problems they couldn't afford to treat, while Riverside Industries faced meaningless fines. I thought about Dr. Patterson's words about being willing to focus intensely on problems others considered impossible. I thought about the difference between parents who feared their child's potential and parents who celebrated it. For the first time since the science competition withdrawal, I felt something like clarity.
The people who claimed to know what was best for me had revealed their true priority, maintaining their own social standing, even if it meant sabotaging my opportunities to make a meaningful difference in the world. The choice was becoming clear, though I wasn't yet ready to acknowledge its full implications. I could continue accepting their limitations as reasonable concerns, or I could begin building a life based on my own values. The comfortable path led to their version of success, safe, conventional, and ultimately hollow. The uncertain path led towards everything they feared: independence, accountability, and the dangerous possibility that I might actually change something that mattered. The slow realization wasn't just about understanding their motivations, it was about recognizing that my worth didn't depend on their approval and my dreams didn't require their permission. The article went live on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 days before my 18th birthday. Poisoned Wells: How Riverside Industries Contaminated 3 Communities While Regulators Looked Away appeared as the lead story in both the school newspaper and the regional online edition that had picked up our investigation. I'd spent 2 months gathering evidence, interviewing affected families, and consulting with environmental lawyers. Dr. Patterson had connected me with university researchers who provided expert analysis of the contamination data. The story was airtight, devastating, and completely factual. By noon, my phone had 12 missed calls from my mother. I was in AP Physics when the principal's voice crackled over the intercom. "Elena Morrison, please report to the main office." 26 pairs of eyes followed me as I gathered my books, whispers starting before I'd even left the room. Mom waited in the principal's office, her face pale except for 2 spots of red high on her cheekbones. Principal Hayes sat behind his desk, wearing the expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else.
Elena, he began carefully, your mother has some concerns about the article you published. What concerns? I remained standing, my backpack clutched against my chest like armor. Mom stood up abruptly. You named specific families. You quoted people by name without considering the consequences. I quoted people with their explicit permission. Everyone I interviewed signed consent forms. Those people don't understand what they've gotten themselves into, she said, her voice rising. Do you have any idea what kind of legal retaliation they could face? What kind of economic pressure? Principal Hayes cleared his throat. Mrs. Morrison, the school's journalism program operates under standard ethical guidelines. Elena followed proper protocols for investigative reporting. Protocols? Mom turned to face him, her composure finally cracking. This isn't the Washington Post. This is a high school newspaper. Since when do we encourage children to attack local businesses with unsubstantiated allegations? I set my backpack down with deliberate calm. Every allegation is substantiated. I have 3 months of research, official regulatory documents, independent lab tests, and testimony from affected residents. You have a 17-year-old's interpretation of complex issues you're not qualified to understand. The words hit like a physical blow, not because they were true, but because they revealed how fundamentally she misunderstood what I'd become. I'm 18 in 3 days. And I am qualified. I've spent 2 years studying environmental chemistry, I've worked with professional scientists, and I've verified every fact in that article. Elena, Principal Hayes interjected, perhaps we should discuss this as a family matter. No! I picked up my backpack. This isn't a family matter. It's about journalism, ethics, and community responsibility, none of which are subject to parental approval. Mom's face went white. Don't you dare speak to me that way. What way? Honestly? Directly? Like an adult who's capable of making informed decisions? You're not an adult. You're a child who thinks she knows better than everyone else. I looked at her for a long moment, seeing clearly for the first time how our entire relationship had been built on her need to keep me small and manageable. I'm not a child anymore, and I do know better than people who think protecting corporate polluters is more important than protecting public health. The silence that followed felt like the space between lightning and thunder, charged with potential destruction. Fine, Mom said finally. If you're such an adult, you can start acting like one. No more driving my car, no more money for your college applications, no more family health insurance after you turn 18. Principal Hayes looked stricken. Mrs. Morrison, perhaps we should...
She wants to be independent. She can learn what independence actually costs. I felt something shift inside me, like a lock turning. Okay. Okay? She seemed surprised by my calm acceptance. I'll figure it out. I always do. That afternoon, I walked home from school for the first time in 2 years, my backpack weighing heavier with each step. The March air still carried winter's bite, and I was grateful for the physical discomfort. It gave me something concrete to focus on besides the growing realization that I'd just been cut loose from everything I'd taken for granted. The house felt different when I entered through the kitchen door. Dad sat at the counter reading the printed version of my article, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He looked up when I entered, his expression unreadable. "Quite a piece of writing," he said quietly. "Thank you." I didn't say it was good. I said it was quite a piece of writing. He folded the paper carefully. "Elena, do you understand what you've done? I've exposed environmental crimes that were harming innocent people. You've declared war on one of this region's largest employers. You've made enemies of people who have the power to make life very difficult for anyone who crosses them." I set my backpack on the counter between us. So I should have stayed quiet, let them keep poisoning communities because they're powerful? You should have considered the consequences for yourself, for us, for everyone whose name you published in that article. The consequences of speaking truth to power?
Dad removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The consequences of being young and idealistic in a world that punishes both qualities. Would you rather I be old and cynical? I'd rather you be safe. The word hung between us like an accusation. Safe. Not ethical, not courageous, not right. Safe. Dad, when you were my age, what did you want to be? The question seemed to catch him off guard. What does that have to do with anything? Just curious, what were your dreams? He was quiet for so long, I thought he wouldn't answer. I wanted to be an architect. Design buildings that would last for centuries. Create spaces that would inspire people. What happened? I grew up. I learned that inspiration doesn't pay mortgages or put food on tables. He gestured around our expensive kitchen. I learned that dreams are luxuries most people can't afford. So you are protecting me from having dreams? I'm protecting you from the disappointment of discovering they don't come true. That evening, I methodically planned my exit strategy. College applications had been submitted months ago with decisions due any day. I had $3,847 in my savings account from part-time work and birthday money. My car was registered in my parents' names, but my laptop, clothes, and research materials belonged to me. Most importantly, I had something my parents had never possessed: absolute clarity about who I was and what I stood for. The acceptance letter from UC Berkeley arrived 2 days after my 18th birthday, thick with financial aid documents and scholarship notifications. The environmental journalism program had offered me a place in their incoming class, along with a merit scholarship covering 60% of tuition costs. I read the letter 3 times before walking upstairs to find my parents in their bedroom, Mom in her vanity removing jewelry, while Dad changed out of his work clothes. "I got into Berkeley," I announced from the doorway. Mom's hands stilled on her pearl necklace. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." "Full major in environmental journalism, merit scholarship." Dad turned around, his shirt half unbuttoned. "Environmental journalism?" They specifically mentioned my article on Riverside Industries. Apparently, it caught the attention of their admissions committee. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. "Elena, Berkeley is very expensive, even with a partial scholarship. I'll manage with student loans and work-study programs." "You can't possibly cover all those costs on your own," Dad protested. "Be reasonable. Consider state schools, practical majors, degrees that lead to stable employment." "I am being reasonable. I'm pursuing work that matters to me with the support of professors who understand its value."
And when you graduate with massive debt and discover there are no jobs for environmental journalists, Mom asked, then I'll have spent 4 years learning to hold powerful institutions accountable for their actions. That seems like time well spent. I could see them processing the implications of my decision, understanding finally that their threats of withdrawal support had freed me rather than controlled me. Elena, Dad tried one more time. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Come back to Earth. Choose something sensible. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm trying to become who I actually am, not who you think I should be. 3 weeks later, I loaded my essential belongings into 2 suitcases and a duffel bag. Sarah's older brother, Mark, had offered to drive me to Berkeley to start early summer orientation. I'd found a job at a campus coffee shop and a shared apartment near the journalism building. As I carried my bags to Mark's car, Mom appeared in the driveway. This doesn't have to be permanent. You can always come home if it doesn't work out. I set down my suitcase and looked at the house where I'd spent the last 6 years learning to make myself smaller to fit other people's expectations.
Mom, this isn't about proving you wrong or punishing you for not understanding me. This is about building a life that aligns with my values.
What if your values change?
What if you discover the world isn't as simple as you think it is? Then I'll adapt, but I'll do it as myself, not as someone else's version of who I should be. She nodded, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Call us when you get there. I will. As Mark's car pulled away from Millbrook Estates, I watched my childhood disappear in the rearview mirror. For the first time in months, I felt something like peace. The uncertainty ahead was mine to navigate. The mistakes to come would be mine to make, and the successes I might achieve would belong entirely to the person I was choosing to become. The breaking point hadn't been dramatic or explosive. It had been quiet, decisive, and absolutely necessary. Berkeley's campus hummed with an energy I'd never experienced in Millbrook's manicured quietness. Students clustered around coffee carts, discussing everything from climate policy to social justice theory, their conversations spilling over with the kind of passionate engagement I'd been taught to moderate. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe at full capacity. My apartment was a cramped 2-bedroom shared with Zara Chen, a junior majoring in environmental engineering, and Amy Rodriguez, a sociology student who kept detailed charts tracking income inequality across California counties. Our living room doubled as a workspace, covered with laptops, research papers, and the organized chaos of 3 ambitious minds pursuing different facets of social change. You're the high school journalist who broke that contamination story, Zara said the day I moved in, helping me carry boxes up 2 flights of narrow stairs. Professor Martinez mentioned your work in our water policy seminar. The casual recognition felt surreal after months of being treated like an overzealous teenager with unrealistic expectations. Here, my investigation wasn't seen as inappropriate ambition, but as a valuable contribution to ongoing environmental advocacy. The summer orientation program paired incoming students with faculty mentors and professional internship opportunities. I was assigned to Dr. Rebecca Stone, whose investigative pieces on corporate environmental crimes had earned her both Pulitzer nominations and corporate lawsuits. Our first meeting took place in her cluttered office overlooking the campus's sustainable garden project. I've read your Riverside Industries piece, she said without preamble, gesturing for me to sit among stacks of legal documents and newspaper clippings. Solid research methodology, compelling narrative structure, appropriate ethical considerations. How did your community respond? I outlined the aftermath. The threats of legal retaliation, my parents' mortification, and the social pressure to stay quiet about ongoing environmental violations. Dr. Stone listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Elena, you've learned something that takes most journalists years to understand. Telling important truths makes powerful people uncomfortable. The question is whether you're prepared for that discomfort to be permanent.
permanent? Real environmental journalism means challenging systems that profit from ecological destruction. Those systems have resources, legal teams, and political connections. They don't simply accept exposure and reform their practices. They fight back. The words should have been intimidating, but instead they felt like validation. Someone finally understood the stakes of the work I wanted to do. My work-study position at the campus coffee shop provided 20 hours per week of steady income and unexpected education in social dynamics. The customers included everyone from undergraduate activists planning protest strategies to graduate students analyzing policy implications of climate legislation. Elena, right? A familiar voice interrupted my eavesdropping one Thursday afternoon. I looked up to see Marcus Rivera, a senior whose investigative pieces on university investment policies had forced administrative transparency reforms. I've been following your work since high school. Impressive stuff. Thank you. I finished wiping down the espresso machine, suddenly self-conscious about being recognized by someone whose journalism I'd admired from afar. I'm starting a new project on California's agricultural water rights. Interested in collaborating? Your background with contamination issues could add an important perspective. The collaboration began with weekend research sessions in the library's environmental studies section. Marcus sharing contacts, while I contributed data analysis skills developed during my high school investigations. The project grew into a comprehensive examination of how wealthy agricultural corporations diverted water from drought-stricken communities to maintain profitable crop production. This is exactly the kind of systemic analysis that changes policy, Marcus explained as we mapped water distribution patterns across the Central Valley. Individual contamination cases matter, but understanding the broader structures of environmental injustice creates opportunities for meaningful reform.
Working with Marcus taught me skills that no classroom could provide. He showed me how to navigate public records requests, how to build trust with sources who feared retaliation, how to translate complex policy language into accessible narratives that engaged readers emotionally while maintaining analytical rigor. Our agricultural water investigation took 4 months to complete. The resulting series ran in the university's independent newspaper and was subsequently picked up by 3 regional publications. More importantly, it caught the attention of environmental law organizations seeking evidence for policy advocacy. Elena, Dr. Stone announced during our weekly mentoring session, the Pacific Environmental Justice Collective wants to hire you as a research assistant for their summer campaign on industrial agriculture reform. The offer represented everything I'd dreamed of: meaningful work with tangible impact, professional recognition based on actual capabilities, compensation that would help me become genuinely financially independent. Most crucially, it validated the path I'd chosen despite family opposition. That evening, I called home to share the news. Mom answered on the 3rd ring, her voice cautious in the way it had become since our confrontation. Elena? Is everything all right? Everything's fine. I wanted to tell you about a job opportunity I've received. I described the research position, the organization's work, the potential for policy influence. As I spoke, I could hear the familiar silence that had preceded so many of our conflicts. That sounds very intense, she said finally. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of responsibility? I've been preparing for exactly this kind of responsibility for 3 years. But sweetheart, you're only 18. Don't you want to enjoy college, make friends, join clubs, experience normal student life? The question revealed how little she understood about my current existence. Mom, I have friends. I'm part of multiple student organizations. I'm experiencing exactly the college life I want. What about dating, social activities, building relationships with people who aren't focused on environmental activism? I thought about Zara and Amy, about Marcus and Dr. Stone, about the community of engaged, passionate people who had become my chosen family. The relationships I'm building are with people who share my values and support my goals. Isn't that what matters? Another long pause. I just worry you're limiting yourself to one type of person, one type of thinking.
Actually, I'm exposing myself to far more diverse perspectives than I ever encountered in Millbrook. The difference is that everyone here takes environmental and social issues seriously. After hanging up, I realized how dramatically my definition of normal had shifted. Where my parents saw dangerous single-mindedness, I experienced intellectual fulfillment. Where they worried about social limitations, I felt genuine belonging for the first time in my life. The summer research position exceeded my expectations in every dimension. The Pacific Environmental Justice Collective operated from a converted warehouse in Oakland, its open floor plan buzzing with lawyers, policy analysts, community organizers, and journalists working on interconnected campaigns addressing environmental racism, corporate accountability, and climate adaptation. Elena's research on pesticide drift impacts has been crucial for our rural community organizing efforts, explained Maria Santos, the collective's community outreach coordinator, during a staff meeting in July. Her ability to make complex environmental science accessible to non-technical audiences is exactly what effective advocacy requires. 6 weeks into the position, I received an email that changed everything. The National Environmental Journalism Association had selected my agricultural water series for their Student Investigative Reporting Award, which included a $5,000 scholarship and guaranteed interview opportunities with major environmental publications. Elena Morrison, the email began, your investigation into California agricultural water rights demonstrates exceptional research methodology, compelling narrative construction, and significant potential for policy impact. The selection committee was particularly impressed by your age and the professional quality of your investigative techniques. I read the message 3 times before its implications were fully registered. Not only had my work earned national recognition, but it had positioned me for opportunities that could define my entire career trajectory.
That evening, Amy and Zara insisted on celebrating with takeout pizza and cheap champagne from the corner store. We sat on our apartment's fire escape, watching Oakland's lights flicker across the bay, while discussing how environmental journalism could influence broader social justice movements. You know what's amazing? Amy said, refilling our plastic cups with champagne that tasted like carbonated grape juice. 6 months ago, you were fighting with your parents about pursuing this work. Now you're winning national awards for it. Zara nodded enthusiastically. And you're not even 19 yet. Imagine what you'll accomplish by the time you graduate. Looking out over the city lights, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Absolute confidence in the path I'd chosen. Not the reckless confidence of teenage rebellion, but the deep satisfaction that comes from aligning your daily actions with your core values. The work was demanding, sometimes frustrating, occasionally discouraging when powerful interests pushed back against our investigations. But every challenge confirmed that I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do, surrounded by people who understood both the importance of the work and the commitment it required. I had built something real, not just a career, but an identity rooted in purpose rather than others' expectations. The foundation was mine, constructed through my own choices and sustained by my own efforts. For the first time in my life, success felt genuinely earned rather than conditionally granted. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in October, during my senior year at Berkeley. I was in my new apartment near campus, a 1-bedroom place I could finally afford thanks to freelance journalism contracts and a teaching assistant position. The caller ID showed my home number, but Jake's voice came through the speaker instead of my parents. Elena? It's me. His voice sounded strained, older than his 21 years. Jake, what's wrong? I need to talk to you about something. About Mom and Dad. He paused, and I could hear voices in the background, familiar cadences of argument that took me back to high school dinners. They're in financial trouble. Serious trouble. I set down my laptop, where I'd been editing an investigation into urban water privatization schemes. What kind of trouble? Dad's company is downsizing. He got laid off 3 weeks ago, but he hasn't told anyone except Mom. They've been burning through savings, and now... Jake's voice dropped to a whisper. They might lose the house.
The news should have shocked me, but instead I felt a strange emotional distance, as if he were describing strangers' problems. "I'm sorry to hear that. What does this have to do with me?" "They want you to come home for Thanksgiving. They have something they need to discuss with you." "Jake, we haven't spoken in 8 months. The last conversation I had with them ended with accusations that I was naive and self-destructive." "I know, but Elena," he paused again, and I heard a door closing. "They've been following your career. Mom has copies of all your articles. Dad subscribed to Environmental Justice Quarterly after they published your piece on textile industry water usage." This information felt more surreal than their financial crisis. They've been reading my work? Reading it, discussing it, showing it to people? "Mom told Mrs. Henderson that you were doing important investigative journalism. Dad mentioned your national award to his golf buddies." A laugh escaped me, bitter and short. Now they're proud of the work they tried to prevent me from doing? They made mistakes, Alina. They know that now, and they need help. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, Jake carefully outlining their situation while avoiding direct requests for assistance. Dad's severance package would last through January. Mom's real estate income had dropped significantly due to market conditions. Their mortgage payments, country club fees, and other fixed expenses exceeded their current income by nearly $4,000 monthly. "What exactly are they asking me to do?" I finally said. "Come home for Thanksgiving. Just listen to what they have to say." After hanging up, I sat in my quiet apartment processing the irony of the situation. The parents who dismissed my environmental work as impractical idealism now faced consequences of their own impractical lifestyle choices. The daughter they'd accused of being financially naive was now earning enough through freelance journalism to support herself comfortably in one of the most expensive cities in the country. I called Amy, who'd graduated the year before and was working for a nonprofit in Sacramento, focused on environmental health policy. "They want something," she said after I'd explained the situation. "The question is whether you're willing to give it to them."
What if they've genuinely changed? What if losing their financial security has helped them understand what really matters? Elena, people don't fundamentally change their values because of temporary financial pressure. They might adjust to their behavior, but their core beliefs about what you should prioritize, that's deeper programming. Amy's skepticism felt harsh, but probably realistic. Still, something in Jake's voice had suggested genuine desperation, not just the normal family manipulation I'd learned to recognize and resist. I decided to accept the Thanksgiving invitation, but on my own terms. The drive to Millbrook took me through landscapes I'd studied extensively for various environmental justice projects. Agricultural regions where pesticide drift affected low-income communities, industrial zones where air quality violations clustered around minority neighborhoods, suburban developments built on former toxic waste sites. Seeing these areas through my professional lens rather than as anonymous highway scenery highlighted how much my perspective had evolved. Millbrook Estates looked smaller than I remembered, its manicured perfection somehow brittle. The fountain in our driveway had been turned off, leaving a concrete basin filled with brown leaves. When I knocked on the front door, Mom answered immediately, as if she'd been waiting by the window. "Elena." Her voice carried relief and apprehension in equal measure. "You look wonderful." I did look wonderful. 3 years of living authentically had given me confidence that translated into better posture, clearer skin, and an energy I'd never possessed during my constrained adolescence. But Mom looked diminished, thinner, with worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there during my high school years. Dad appeared in the entryway, his usual commanding presence muted. He wore khakis and a polo shirt instead of his typical business attire, and his handshake felt uncertain. "Thank you for coming," he said simply. Thanksgiving dinner proceeded with surreal politeness. They asked about my work, my apartment, my future plans, listening to my answers with attention I'd never experienced from them before.
But underlying their interest was a nervous energy that suggested they were building towards something. "Elena," Mom began as we cleared the dinner dishes, "we owe you an apology." I continued scraping plates, waiting for her to continue. "We were wrong about your journalism career. We were wrong to discourage your environmental research. We were wrong to try to control your choices instead of supporting your ambitions." The words sounded rehearsed, delivered with the careful precision of someone who'd practiced them multiple times. "Thank you for saying that," I replied neutrally. Dad joined us in the kitchen, dish towel in hand. "We've been reading your articles, following your career progression. The work you're doing is impressive, important, more than impressive, influential. We had no idea environmental journalism could be so substantial." The conversation felt like stepping into an alternate reality where my parents had suddenly developed appreciation for everything they'd previously dismissed. But I'd learned to recognize manipulation disguised as validation. "What do you need from me?" I asked directly. They exchanged the familiar look of wordless communication. Then Dad cleared his throat. "We're facing some financial challenges. Temporary setbacks that require short-term adjustments to our living situation." I mentioned Dad lost his job. "A corporate restructuring," Mom corrected quickly. "These things happen in business cycles. The severance package will carry us through the first quarter of next year, Dad, but we need to reduce our monthly expenses while I explore new opportunities." I waited for them to reach their actual request. "We were hoping," Mom said carefully, "that you might consider moving back home temporarily, just until we stabilize our situation." The suggestion hit me like cold water. Move back home? "It would benefit everyone," Dad explained, his sales training evident in the smooth delivery. "You could save on rent, we could save on our mortgage by having additional income, and we could reconnect as a family." "You want me to pay rent to live in my childhood bedroom?"
We'd work out a fair arrangement, Mom said quickly. Much less than you're paying for that expensive Berkeley apartment. I set down the plate I'd been holding and looked at them directly. Let me make sure I understand this. You want me to abandon the life I've built, move back to a place where you spent years undermining my ambitions, and subsidize the lifestyle that you can no longer afford? "Alina, that's not fair," Dad protested. "We're offering you a chance to help your family while saving money yourself. By giving up my independence and returning to a dynamic where you controlled my choices?" "We've changed," Mom insisted. "We understand now how capable you are, how successful you've become." I felt the old familiar pressure to accommodate their needs at the expense of my own well-being. The difference was that now I recognized it immediately and had the experience to resist it. "I'm not moving back home," I said quietly, but firmly. Their faces fell in synchrony, disappointment replacing hopeful expectation. "Alina, we're your family," Mom tried again. "When families face difficulties, they support each other." "You're right about families supporting each other, but support works both ways. When I was facing difficulties, when I needed encouragement for my research, validation for my career choices, acceptance of my values, where was your support?" "We were protecting you from disappointment," Dad said, his voice defensive. "You were protecting yourselves from discomfort. There's a difference." I walked to the living room window, looking out at the neighborhood where I'd learned to make myself smaller to fit other people's expectations. "I'll help you," I said, turning back to face them, "but not by sacrificing my independence. I'll contribute to some of your essential expenses for the next 6 months while you transition to a sustainable lifestyle." "Elena, 6 months isn't enough time to—" Mom began. "6 months is enough time to downsize to a house you can afford, eliminate unnecessary expenses, and develop realistic long-term financial planning." Dad's face hardened. "You're going to lecture us about financial responsibility? I'm going to offer the same kind of conditional support you offered me for 18 years. Help that comes with expectations about making better choices." The silence that followed felt familiar, the weight of unmet expectations and conflicting values colliding in the space between us. "Take it or leave it," I added, "but I'm not moving backward to accommodate choices I didn't make." Mom's eyes filled with tears, but I felt no corresponding guilt. Their financial crisis wasn't my responsibility to solve, especially not by dismantling the life I'd worked so hard to build. The test of boundaries was clearer than I'd expected. They'd offered validation and appreciation, but only as currency to purchase my compliance. When I refused to be bought, their true priorities became visible once again. I drove back to Berkeley that evening feeling something like relief. The people who tried to limit my potential were now asking me to rescue them from the consequences of their own limitations. The irony was complete, but not particularly satisfying. What mattered was that I recognized the manipulation and rejected it cleanly, without anger or emotional entanglement. The boundary lines I'd drawn were holding firm. 2 years later, the invitation arrived on official city letterhead. Mayor's Environmental Excellence Award Ceremony, recognizing outstanding contributions to environmental protection and community welfare. My name appeared as the recipient of the Outstanding Young Environmental Journalist Award, scheduled for presentation at City Hall on a Saturday afternoon in May. I stared at the invitation, processing the magnitude of recognition it represented. The award came with a $10,000 grant for continuing environmental research and guaranteed publication opportunities with 3 major environmental magazines. More importantly, it validated the path I'd chosen with the kind of official recognition that couldn't be dismissed as youthful idealism. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 p.m. on May 15th. RSVPs were requested for guests. I called Jake first, knowing he'd be genuinely excited about the news. "Elena, this is incredible!" His enthusiasm carried through the phone. "A mayor's award? That's like official recognition. I know, I can hardly believe it myself. Are you going to invite Mom and Dad?" The question I'd been avoiding since opening the envelope. "I don't know. What do you think?" Jake was quiet for a moment. They've been different since Thanksgiving. Quieter. They sold the house and moved to that condo in Oak Springs. Dad's working for a smaller company now, making about half what he used to. Mom's doing more volume real estate, less of the luxury market.
Different how? They ask about you more. Real questions, not the dismissive stuff from before. And they've stopped talking about your journalism like it's a phase you'll outgrow. I considered this information, weighing it against years of experience with their capacity for genuine change versus temporary adaptation. They'd want to come if you invited them, Jake continued, but they're afraid to ask. They know they burn those bridges pretty thoroughly. After hanging up, I drafted 2 versions of an invitation email. The first was formal and distant, a notification rather than an invitation. The second was warmer, offering an olive branch without forgetting the history between us. I sent the warmer version. 3 days later, Mom called. "Alina, we received your email about the awards ceremony." Her voice carried a tentative joy that sounded unfamiliar. "We're so proud of you, so honored that you thought to include us." "Thank you. We wouldn't miss it for anything. This is exactly the kind of recognition your work deserves." Something in her tone suggested she genuinely meant it, not just because she needed something from me. "Mom, I want you to understand something. If you come, it's to celebrate work that you once tried to prevent me from doing, work that you called naive and impractical. We know that, sweetheart. We were wrong, completely wrong. I'm not saying this to punish you. I'm saying it because I need you to understand what you're celebrating. We understand, and Elena, we're sorry. Not just for the Thanksgiving conversation, but for years of not seeing who you really were." The ceremony took place in City Hall's main auditorium, a space designed to accommodate several hundred people. I'd invited my Berkeley friends, my colleagues from the Environmental Justice Collective, Dr. Stone, and Marcus Rivera, who'd driven down from Sacramento, where he now worked for a policy advocacy organization. When I arrived, wearing the navy dress suit I'd bought specifically for professional events, I spotted my parents immediately. They sat in the 3rd row, dressed more modestly than I remembered from previous formal occasions. Dad wore a simple gray suit instead of his usual expensive tailoring, and Mom's jewelry was understated. But they both looked genuinely happy, not the performative happiness of people trying to project success. Mayor Patricia Williams, a progressive politician whose environmental policies had earned national attention, delivered opening remarks about the importance of protecting natural resources for future generations.
She spoke specifically about the role of journalism in holding institutions accountable and making environmental science accessible to public audiences. Our next award recognizes someone who exemplifies these principles, she announced. At 22 years old, Alana Morrison has produced investigative journalism that has influenced state policy, prompted corporate accountability measures, and brought national attention to environmental justice issues in California. As I walked to the podium, I caught sight of my parents in the audience. They were applauding enthusiastically, their faces bright with unmistakable pride. Mom wiped tears from her eyes, and Dad was grinning more broadly than I'd ever seen. Mayor Williams presented the award, a beautiful glass sculpture embedded with recycled materials, and shook my hand while cameras captured the moment. Ms. Morrison, your work represents the future of environmental advocacy. Thank you for your service to our communities. The reception afterward buzzed with conversations about policy initiatives, collaborative research opportunities, and upcoming environmental challenges requiring journalistic attention. I moved between groups, discussing projects, and making connections, feeling completely in my element. Elena, Dad's voice interrupted my conversation with a state water policy analyst. Could we talk for a moment? I excused myself and followed him to a quieter corner of the reception hall, where Mom waited nervously. We wanted to thank you, Dad began, not just for inviting us, but for becoming exactly who you were meant to become, despite our interference. Your mother and I have had a lot of time to think over the past 2 years about what we prioritized, what we valued, what we thought success looked like. Mom nodded. We were so focused on protecting you from failure that we nearly prevented you from succeeding.
The work you're doing matters, Dad said simply. It matters more than anything we thought was important when you were younger. I studied their faces, looking for signs of the conditional approval that had characterized so many previous conversations. Instead, I saw something that looked like genuine respect. Thank you for saying that. Elena, Mom added, we know we can't undo the years when we failed to support your dreams, but we want you to know that we see you now. We see who you are and what you've accomplished, and we're incredibly proud. Later that evening, after my friends had returned to their respective cities and my parents had driven back to their modest condo, I sat in my apartment looking at the award. The glass caught the light from my desk lamp, refracting it into small rainbows across my wall. I thought about the journey from that first science fair project in high school to this moment of professional recognition. The path had required me to choose my own values over others' expectations, to build relationships based on shared purpose rather than convenience, and to define success according to impact rather than income or status. The award wasn't the endpoint. It was validation that the foundation I'd built was solid enough to support whatever came next. Environmental crises would continue requiring investigation, corporate accountability would remain an ongoing struggle, and climate change would demand increasingly sophisticated journalism to help communities understand and respond to its impacts. But I would face those challenges from a position of strength, surrounded by people who understood the urgency of the work and supported my role in it. The scared teenager who'd once hidden her ambitions to avoid family conflict had become a confident professional whose work was changing conversations about environmental responsibility. My parents' pride felt meaningful now because it was based on understanding rather than possession. They weren't proud of me as a reflection of their parenting, but as recognition of choices I'd made independently, often in opposition to their guidance. The foundation I'd built wasn't constructed from their approval or society's conventional definitions of success. It was built from purpose, persistence, and the radical decision to become who I actually was rather than who others thought I should be. As I prepared for bed, I realized I was no longer angry about the years of misunderstanding and conflict. Those experiences had taught me to recognize authentic support versus manipulation,
to value relationships that encouraged growth rather than control, and to trust my own judgment even when it diverged from popular opinion. The ceremony had marked more than professional achievement. It had completed a circle, bringing my parents into a life they'd once tried to prevent me from building, not as participants or controllers, but as witnesses to what was possible when someone refused to accept limitations others tried to impose. The girl who'd once been told her dreams were impractical had just been honored by the mayor for work that was changing her community. The foundation was solid, the future was bright, and the family relationships that mattered most had been rebuilt in terms of mutual respect, rather than conditional love. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.